Well, thank you all again for joining us tonight. We've got about 30 or so folks live here on Zoom. Really looking forward to tonight's presentation entitled Using the Digital Public Library for Genealogy. The Digital Public Library, acronym is DPLA, has resources from the Library of Congress, the HathiTrust, the HathiTrust, the Internet Archive, and thousands of other museums and archives. All are available for free in one search. The DPLA will enable you to add details to your ancestral tree or family history for which you already have names and dates. Millions of materials are available, including genealogies, photographs, town histories, vital records, newspapers, manuscripts, letters, and family Bible records. Many genealogists are using the Digital Public Library to help them break through their brick walls. And as I mentioned, this presentation will be led by Diane Brooks-Sherry, who is the Merrimack Valley Chapter President of the Massachusetts Society of Genealogists. So all 30 of us on the line, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Diane for joining us tonight. And Diane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. After that wonderful description, there's not much more I can say, but I will show you pictures to at least help, because I know, like me, not all of us are audio learners. It helps to see some things. And I am only the Merrimack Valley Chapter President for the Massachusetts Society of Genealogists until June 30th. I am stepping down after 2 terms. If any of you are interested, the website for the society is MSOGINC.org. We have our membership year starts on September 1st and goes till the end of August. We have been in existence since 1975, and we have just under 400 members, I believe, at the moment. Although I could be wrong, I haven't looked at the total numbers, but all are welcome. $25 for a year's membership gets you 10 newsletters. Plus, we have our journal that has been published for over 40 years. It gets published 3 times a year. You get a copy of that, as well as we do 9 webinars for members only per year. And we keep the recordings up behind the membership wall for those for about 3 months for each one. So thank you so much for giving up your evening and listening to me yak about the DPLA, which for those of you that I apologize, I did not put a handout together, but what you really need is the letter D, the letter P, the period, the letter A, and the letter A, L and A, excuse me. So dp.la is how you find the Digital Public Library of America. It is a terrific source, and this is what their homepage looks like. So if you went to dp.la, this is what you would see. It began the concept started in 2010 in Boston, actually. And a group of folks got together with some help from Harvard University and several large multinational or national fundraisers to pull together librarians, archivists, as well as technology people to try to broaden access for everyone for free to materials that you could get at your local library. But there were also other materials that your local library might be willing to supply you, but couldn't. They didn't have the capability to contact a local library in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or somewhere else. So the Digital Public Library Group worked from 2010 until the end of 2012 and launched in 2013 with the idea that they would provide not all of the material, but instead a link or a unit that you could go to, a portal for you to go into and do searches. And instead you would link not to anything held by the DPLA, but instead to the materials of all of those thousands of cultural institutions, museums, libraries, and archives across the country. So when you go to the DPLA, you are searching in one portal, but it's taking you to many of those places, including the HathiTrust that Robert spoke about. So if you went into dp.la, you come to the homepage. Now, when they were created or launched in 2013, they came up with this concept of how do we organize all of these different organizations? And they created what they call hubs. They have two types of hubs: content hubs, which are extremely large institutions that have many millions of items in each of their own individual digital collections. These include HathiTrust, the Internet Archive, the Library of Congress, the National Archive, the New York Public Library, among many, many others. And then they also have service hubs. Well, a particular service hub could have 1 million things in their digital archive. However, that particular hub is actually made up of a group of organizations that work together. And the service hub for Massachusetts is the Digital Commonwealth. So the Tewksbury Public Library and all the public libraries in Massachusetts combined together supplied copies of anything that they had that was digitized. And then the Digital Commonwealth links all of those items into one package and pulls it into the portal for DPLA. These include everything that a genealogist might ordinarily be looking for in an actual archive, a registry of deeds office sometimes, but it also, they even did things like digitized early baseball uniforms from stars. They've digitized objects like old irons that would have been heated on the wood stove and then used to press clothes. So they have taken as many things as they possibly can and pulled them together to be accessible in one place. There are many hubs that exist already, but they are still working to include more. Among those that are in development right now, and I can't wait for this to come live, is New Hampshire, because I grew up and was born and brought up in Massachusetts, but have spent all of my life coming back and forth to New Hampshire and have been living in New Hampshire now for over 20 years. But it's one of those areas that if you want to try to find records currently online, you pretty much can't. You almost have to come to New Hampshire if you have ancestors here. Fortunately now, with Digital Public Library's assistance, they're taking and putting more and more of those things to make them accessible, because those of us that had ancestors that went west, or those of you who actually are living in Massachusetts but came from another place, you may not be researching here, you want to be researching where your ancestors lived. So we don't always live in the area where we want to do research. Now, among the areas that the Digital Public Library has, excuse me, is this area called exhibitions. And what they have done is work some of the staffers, but also some of the teachers and college professors that volunteer for them have gotten together and created these modules that are a combination of maps, still pictures, sometimes moving pictures, sometimes a sound file, and pull them together by topic. And many teachers use these as an adjunct to the textbook to bring things more alive. So the children can understand, and even college students can understand, what was it really like before modern technology? I would assume that most of you remember the old dial phones. And many of you had a very long phone cord, and you were able to pull the phone into another room to hide from your parents and your siblings as you tried to talk to the one you had a crush on. My grandson wanted to know why I had an old landline still plugged in my house and how did it work. So even within our lifetimes, I used to tell my high school students when I taught, I never had to pay for water. Whiteout didn't exist. Computers were only in colleges and the Defense Department. And they all thought that I was absolutely crazy. But in the last 50 years, life is not like it was 50 years ago. So this type of exhibition allows people to see, and whether it's a school child, or if you're like me, sometimes you just like to see what things were like, or you vaguely remember something from school, or now that you're researching, what was your grandfather's experience? Maybe he was a teen or a 20-something during the Depression. Maybe he actually helped to build some of the conservation camps, which are now here in New Hampshire. Many of the White Mountain National Forest guideposts, sometimes the bathroom facilities, were actually built by the CCC. The same thing in Western Massachusetts for the Great Barrington area, the North Adams area. So we may want to say, okay, well, our grandfather was alive at that point. What would it have been like if he served in this particular area? And this is one way that the DPLA makes things like that available. We also, excuse me, I shouldn't say we, because I'm not employed by them, but the Digital Public Library has also been adding resources every 6 months, every year. They upload more files every single month as far as individual items, but they've now added eBooks. They now work with libraries that you can actually check out eBooks through DPLA and HathiTrust and the Internet Archive, and you can use that. It hopefully was going to help with libraries. They don't have to spend quite as much of their budget for some of the things that might make it more difficult. And it also may be available or make available eventually some of the smaller press books that those of us that are genealogists and amateur historians would like to see. We wonder, what was 19th century Kansas City like? What were some of these other areas like? And we don't want to have to spend $25 or $30 to order a book or go to the local bookstore and have them try to find the small press book from the Historical Society out in the Midwest. So these eBooks, not only for the popular reading, but also for some of the research, they're hoping to expand with that as well. And just recently, within the last 2 years, or well, a little bit more than 2 years, probably took them 2 years to really finish the publishing. And these are the 3 major works that they have pulled together and published in one place. If you were interested in any of these large investigations and things that happened in Washington, and you wanted to read for yourself rather than a summary, you used to have to try to chase from resource to resource to resource. So the Digital Public Library pulled these together in one location, and it allows people who want to do in-depth reading the ability to do that. And when you go to dp.la, they have a terrific overview of how to search. I'm not going to go over every step because most of you have already started doing search, but it is a good place for you to browse and just review it before you move on. I'll point out many of its features, but possibly not everything you're interested in tonight. So do check out their search tips, because they are this portal linked to thousands of different organizations. There are some differences possibly than just doing a regular Google search or a Boolean search to try to find information. So it doesn't hurt to have that little extra tip. They also have some tips and some sort of individual pages for helping to do research. And of course, family research, genealogists are things that we're talking about. Their research guide, again, I'm going to talk about a bunch of it, but not all of it. You are available to be able to use all of these things, and I'm going to try to just show you some of the examples of what they have, excuse me, for possible resources tonight. But they do, again, have the research guide for you to be able to go back And if I point out something and you want to find out more about how to find more of that type of record, they are covered in here quite a bit. Now, these are some of the recommended sources that they list in their guide, but it's by no means everything. But you'll notice family photographs. You might be able to find things here that you may not find anywhere else, because if someone's elderly aunt was the inheritor, inherited all of the family photos, when she was getting ready to pass on, if none of the nieces and nephews wanted them, it's possible they got donated to a local historical society that might have been able to actually digitize them. So you might have a distant cousin out there that has uploaded some of the photographs that you also are trying to identify. Family Bibles. My family never had a family Bible as far as I know. But many family Bibles, you can't divide it up. It's not like one chair is going to one daughter and another chair is going to another daughter. It could have gone somewhere else. If you had an ancestor who went over the Oregon Trail, maybe your family Bible is in Oregon at a local historical society. Possibly they digitized at least, if not, probably not the whole Bible, but any notes of births, deaths, and marriages from the front few pages. Letters to and from the home front for the Civil War. Again, maybe not your ancestor's letter, but if your ancestor served in the Massachusetts Regiment, maybe another member of the Mass Regiment's letters have been digitized. Maps are always important. They have maps going back to the first European maps drawn in the US, but they also, Digital Public Library, even though it's located here in the US, all of these institutions have maps and resources from around the world. You'll see many things that are in many languages, the most common, of course, English, but also many in French, many in Spanish, Dutch, German, and Portuguese are probably the top non-English languages, but also a lot now too in Japanese, Chinese, Korean. You name the language, there are resources here. Yearbooks. Yes, your grandchildren can look you up and find out what you looked like when you were 18 or 17, depending on when you graduated high school. Also, military records, photographs and service records, also draft cards. So if your grandfather actually was eligible to fill out a draft card, even if they didn't get drafted for World War I or World War II, you may be able to find it free on DPLA without having to go into the library and using Ancestry's library edition. Oral histories are particularly important because that gives us the spices that add to the extra details of life. And family history and genealogy books, those are some of the books that are those small press books that might only have really had 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 copies printed that may be very difficult to find. But your local historical society has them. The local library has them. Well, that's fantastic if you're living in Tewksbury and your ancestors were in Tewksbury. But what happens if, like I said, they were from Kenosha, Illinois, or somewhere else? You want to find out what other things are out there where your ancestors lived. Now, if you put in a search in DPLA, just to show you the breadth of records, I put in just the word Massachusetts and came up with just under 1.5 million items. That's an awful lot for a small state when you compare Massachusetts to, I mean, come on, Massachusetts compared to what, one little teeny tiny bit of Texas or California, all right? And they're represented by an awful lot of items. If you look on the left side of the screen, you have a refine column. If you are an ambitious person or a very organized person and you would like to write your family history and self-publish, as Sarah Campbell has done with hers, it tells you how you may use them. because the Digital Public Library is the portal. They are not the owner of these materials. Each of these materials is held by and owned by its own institution. So you'll notice that the 3 items in the right column are all military records from the War Department, and they're held at the National Archives in Washington. They've been digitized and appear here, but the item is owned by the federal government through the National Archives. If you want to be able to use the image of this in a published work, you have to actually work with the National Archives and follow their rules about using that particular image. You also have to be careful because not all of the materials are about those who are long gone, like these particular records. Many of them could be something much more recent, like a congressional hearing. If you have an unusual last name, type it in DPLA and see what pops up. If you have a very common last name, you will probably get too many hits. I have one of my great-great-grandparents' family's last name is Lippold, Lippold. I typed it in just to see what would pop up. Sure enough, my grandmother's first cousin actually was the director of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. His Senate confirmation hearing popped up. Now, he's still living. He just turned 95 last week. And I actually talked to him about it. He said, "You found me on the internet?" He just thought that was amazing. So if you have an unusual name in your ancestral research, try it. You don't know what's going to come up. If you also look on the left under refining your search, in addition to the permissions, it tells you what kinds of objects they have: text, images, moving images, sound, and physical objects. So you have all of those to choose from. You can also choose the subject. Now, when you click on subject, it will expand. You can also narrow things by date. And here we just checked with a general location of Massachusetts. Now, if I put Massachusetts and genealogy together, of course, I'm going to have a much smaller list. So you can also try Wisconsin genealogy or any other area to see what comes up as well, just to sort of get your feet wet and explore. You'll notice here, not only do we have 2 published genealogies that have a connection to Massachusetts, but the first piece is actually the Massachusetts magazine, and it's not available here at the Boston Public Library. They have a collection of them in Wisconsin. So we never know what types of things from our ancestor could have made it somewhere else that we didn't realize they had it. So it's one of those ideas that having DPLA, you don't have to then buy a plane ticket and get to Wisconsin to try to do all of these things in advance. You can try to explore more in depth, and it simplifies it because you don't have to go in and search Internet Archive, then remember what search terms you used, then log out of that, then go to HathiTrust and do the same thing again. Instead, you can start with the digital library and search there, and it will do the one search for all of those locations. And if you're looking for something more recent, you'll notice on the left, you can also narrow it down. If right now you're really looking at your grandparents, then you can start the search 1890, 1900, and you can end the search maybe to the point when you were 10 or 12 or 15, and you're pretty sure you remember a lot of things. So you're really looking for the earlier information about them. It gives you that opportunity to take and narrow these things down. Again, if we narrow from a state down to a very specific location, we get a shorter list. And here on the left, what I really wanted you to see is that you have different subjects. Now, because the state hospital in Tewksbury was such a major landmark for so many decades, you'll notice that photographs mentally ill in psychiatric hospitals and temporary asylum are the first items there, because the state did so many investigations, documentations, reports, that comes up very early in the numbers. But you'll also see that Wang Laboratories appears. So this shows you the diversity of even a small town, because Tewksbury by no means, even today, is not a bustling metropolis with 8-story buildings and fire ladder trucks and all of those things that you're familiar with if you go to Boston. Now, when you're doing this type of research, you do want to try to diversify, but you also need to narrow down. It's one of those, we can do a broad search, we can do a narrow search and really dig deep. But whenever you're beginning, you do want to try to get the lay of the land. And you need to look for your ancestors and understand what it was like where they lived when they lived there. Because even though Tewksbury is not a bustling metropolis, it's much different now than it was on either of the first 2 maps that come up here. Because I ordered this particular list. If you notice the top, near the top, it says sort by oldest to newest in items per page. So you can actually go back and forth. You can have it newest to oldest, oldest to newest. You can also click if you really wanted photographs of a particular area, you're wondering what it looked like. Possibly there was a building that was important. I graduated from Methuen High School back in 1979, which I know a lot of you will think, geez, she's so little or young compared to, other people. But there are many buildings that were in Methuen because my grandmother grew up there and her mother grew up there that no longer exist. But we can find out about them because of the early historical postcards that were recorded back in the late 1800s with the advent of photography, and then also into the 1900s. People would go away, people would travel, they would send you a pictorial postcard from where they visited. Well, many of those famous buildings were captured. So you can get an idea of what the area was like back when your grandmother or your grandfather lived there, and sometimes even earlier. But the other way are some of these early maps. When Congress first was beginning in 1790, after the Constitution was ratified, they had to order a census of the entire country, the 13 states, so that they could determine the representation in Congress. Well, they sent a request to the states, or actually basically an order to the states, that each state had to have a census done. In addition, the state of Massachusetts and many other states ordered that each town had to submit a detailed map showing their borders, their main roads, and any other areas of significance to the state government. So many of these still exist. And this first one of Tewksbury, this is if I just clicked and went straight from the search list, it doesn't take me exactly to the map in the first step. But you can see, okay, I clicked on the right link. That was the picture I was looking at. Well, yeah, I can't see the map yet. It's far too small, especially for those of us with older eyes. Even with glasses on, you can't quite read it. But you'll notice there's all this information underneath. It tells you that it was a plan of Tewksbury, surveyed by Moses Abbott, and it's dated 1794 to 1795. Obviously, he was walking with chain and bar and measuring by rods. It did not get done in a week. Okay, it took several weeks to get this done, to get this drawn. It tells you the format underneath here. It tells you where the actual original is. It's in the Massachusetts Archives of the Office of the Secretary of State Collection. And it's in their series called Town Plans 1794, because the state had every community was supposed to send them this. If you look on the right where it says tools underneath the map, you'll see that there are, you can put it on Pinterest, you can tweet about it, you can post it with Facebook, you can email it to yourself, just as you do if you're in the library doing research on ancestry and you want to email a copy of a birth certificate home to yourself, you can do that. But underneath that, with the email citation, this is the stuff that your English teachers drilled into your heads when you were children, well, high school children, about you had to find information and then you had to explain where you got it. Show of hands, anybody remember IBID, LOXIT, and OPSIT from typing? Thank you. I can't tell you exactly how to use them anymore, but I still know those words. And then I had to teach high school and they don't do footnotes like that anymore. They do them a little bit differently. So if you're going to write something up, if you're going to put it in the letter and you want, you know, a family newsletter, or even if you do a blog, several people that I know have their own blogs. So they put up something like this and their readers want to be able to want to know where to find the original map so they can look at it themselves and really get an idea for what's there. Well, you need to tell them how to get there. The nice thing the DPLA has worked with all of the contributors is there's a cite button. So the cite button, you can click on that and you can basically copy the information and paste it and not have to remember periods and commas and all of those things that our English teachers were driving us crazy about. Underneath that is the best thing ever, the downloads. Now, depending on the resource, if it's an entire book, not every single partner will allow you to download it. But in this case, this particular map, you can actually download the complete file of the original scan to your own computer, which means you can zoom in and make it as big as you want. If you know, okay, based on this map, I know roughly where my house is, I know roughly where my grandparents' house was, you can get an idea of what it was like in that part of town back in the late 1700s. And it really does help you try to put yourself into ancestors' shoes. And obviously, since this is Tewksbury, we're talking about Tewksbury right now. Now, when you click, you'll notice there is a plus, zoom in piece on the map. If you actually zoom in, you can see it. And I actually rotated it 90 degrees because all of the handwriting was running this way. So you saw it on the previous screen vertically, and now it's displayed horizontally. And it is a little hard to see, I know, even on the computer screen, because I'm on my old Mac laptop instead of the iPad, because the iPad doesn't do so well with online as far as Zoom and things. But if you could take this and zoom in, you can see very faint traces of the dotted lines that are the roads that existed back then. Now, the roads, some of them could be in roughly the same location, although with modern technology now we can blast rocks out of the way and fill in wetlands that they wouldn't have back then. But often the ponds are the same, the hills would be the same. So you can try to see how difficult it would have been to get from one edge of Tewksbury to the diagonal cross. It would have been much more challenging because there are very few roads, very few pathways. It would have been a lot of rough walking or horseback to get from one area to the other. Now, this map doesn't show the early landowners, although some communities did. It depended on their surveyor. Some of these early maps for some communities around the country do actually have little house symbols. Sometimes they even have the names of the homeowners. So you can then look in the deeds and try to find more information. But it's great to be able to compare and to look at these and to be able to download. Now, if this were just a page in a history of Tewksbury that had been published, say, in 1910. Someone had gone back and done the story of the early founding of the town, and it included this map as an image. It would be up to the institute that owns the book, the copy of the book. And many of those early town histories that were published in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there are several copies. So there will be definitely one in the Library of Congress, may or may not have been digitized. But the Boston Public Library might have digitized a copy. Harvard might have digitized a copy. The New York Public Library might have digitized a copy, or any other institution. And when they digitize it, they tell you through the Digital Public Library, can you download just one page when you're looking at this particular book? Or like with HathiTrust, can you download for some of the books, the entire book? So if it's something that you find a book or a history of a certain community, and you know your family lived there for 3 generations, and you're going to keep coming back to looking for more information, and suddenly you realize, oh, wait a minute, that's what his wife's maiden name was. I need to go see if I can go back to that town history and find out what her father was. Is he mentioned in that town history I saw last year? If you can find one of the institutes, one of the providers of images that allows you to download the whole book, and it's a town that you had 1 or 2 or more generations in, do that, because sometimes the same book will be available from 3 different providers. Now, if you know your family only lived there for 10 years, then you're probably not going to need to do that. But you can still look and download at least some of those images. Now, if you look at this map that was done in the late 1790s, this map is the next one that was on the list, and I'm not going to even zoom in on it. But you'll notice there's a lot more detail. There are hash marks to show some of the growth of the trees, where the woods are versus fields. There are some indications of some of the hilltops. And that gives you an idea if your great-great-grandparent was a farmer and then he married somebody who lived on the other side of town. Well, there's 3 hills between them. Gee, what did they have to do to get to see each other? Up and down over the hills, back and forth. You know, now you look, you can see even at this scale, a lot more roads. The 1830s, a lot more stagecoaches. We don't quite really have railroads yet, but it's easier to move around. And of course, if your ancestors lived in Haverhill back in the 1830s, you had the river. So it was a lot easier to move a further distance along the river than it would have been. So whenever you're researching, definitely look for early maps as well as your birth, marriage, and death certificates. Early maps can really help you to try to figure out where your ancestors came from and possibly where they went. And especially if you know that it was Mrs. John Smith. Well, that's great. What was her first name and what was she when she was born? What did her parents name her and what was her birth name? All right. And luckily next month, Sarah will help you out with some of that, because those are one of the brick walls that many of us bang our heads against. Now, I just gave you a very brief introduction of how to get to the homepage, how to do some basic ideas of searches, and then you come up with a list, you click on it, and then you get out to the partner site that shows you the image, and you can either download it or you can, zoom in and take a look at it. The other types of things you can find, those published vital records, almost every community in Massachusetts and many in other states published vital records up to 1850, 1870, maybe 1880 in books. And they were created in, 8,000 copies or 10,000 copies. Well, you can actually look for the vital records of Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Vital Records, Wisconsin, and see what comes up. If you want to find out In my case, my Lippold family came in 1870 to New York City. Well, Carl Lippold, who came over as a child, married Amelia Seizig, who came over as a child in 1865. They both landed in New York City. And in 1870, they're living in Methuen. I can't figure out how they got from New York City to Methuen. I'm still searching that. But you can actually find passenger lists that were compiled and published, especially for for Boston, of course, but also for Baltimore, also for other places. Land documents, some of those very early deeds that were written out by hand, some communities or some registries in some states and some towns have digitized those. You have one of those unusual names and you put it in, you might come up with a handwritten deed from someone else to your ancestor or from your ancestor selling to someone else. Draft cards for both World War I and World War II can be found. Again, not for every community. It depends on the local institution that's in the cooperative with the Digital Public Library. And almost every single one of them, as soon as they have the money and the time and the staff time, are making as many records as they can available. But just like the rest of us, they have budgets they have to live within. So every month, new things get added in. Just because it's not there now doesn't mean that a month from now or 6 months from now, put a little note on your calendar. And if you're somebody, I know people that do genealogy all winter long, and then they're gardening and they're walking and they're doing everything in the wonderful weather. They put everything sort of aside and they pick it up in the fall when it gets dark earlier and it's colder. Make notes of where you looked, make notes of what you found and what you didn't find. How are you going to know if you found that record before? When you searched for John Smith, and I won't even use John Smith, it's too common. But if anybody knows a John Harold White who disappeared from the Merrimack Valley in 1907, I'd greatly appreciate it. I can't find him either. He's my great-grandfather who walked out on the family and I don't know where he went. But I'm keeping track of where I look for him. And then I have to write down that I didn't find him, because otherwise I'm going to keep going back and I'm going to keep looking. But if I go back and I find him the next time, I make a note that now I found him, or at least I found a John Harold White, because there's several. You need to be able to keep track of what was there when you looked there so that you can tell whether or not it's something new or something you saw before but you forgot. Anybody else like me have 4 different copies of the same record that you found when you were trying to clean up your files? Yeah. If I could only have all those hours back, I might have knocked down another brick wall. But those types of things are available. Diaries and journals. The New Hampshire Historical Society, I was doing some work for a family that asked me to see if I could find out where their ancestors, or when their ancestors died and where they were buried. Well, I didn't actually find the answer to that. However, I found a neighbor of theirs who had written an entire essay of about 10 paragraphs, handwritten, the old copper plate, of what it was like when he was a child living in that community and going by sled, horse-drawn sled, from farm to farm and to church, and hearing the wolves howl at night and having to go through snow up to his waist to get to school and all of those things. You would not believe the number of little details that exist in the local history section. I bet Robert could tell you tales about some of the precious things that are in the local shelf, for lack of a better term, or corner, for early tales of Tewksbury.
We have an entire room, if you can believe that.
Okay, well, I haven't been to the Tewksbury Library, so it's hard to tell. Sometimes it depends on, I live in a town that when I moved here, the entire library shared the house with the Historical Society. And it was basically two 20 by 15 foot rooms. One was the Historical Society and one was the library. Now, since I've moved here, they now have, the Historical Society has both of those rooms, and the library now has an area that's 5 times that, and built their own building. But yeah, so I mean, spend time with Robert, especially once the library is really open and you can gather and explore those things. I would bet someone has a written memorial, has written about their childhood or their high school years, or there was a historical society that was established in 1880 trying to talk about the pride and history of Tewksbury, and somebody wrote down those stories, and you can see what they are like.
Diane, what you speak to is exactly what's happening. So our Tewksbury Historical Society is digitizing all sorts of old family records at the moment. It's a multi-year process, and COVID has slowed them down. But they got grant funding, they hired a part-time archivist, and I think the project is getting slowly back on track. So I don't think anyone on the line is a member of the Historical Society, but perhaps I'll have more information on their project at the next meeting.
That's wonderful, because even if it isn't, you know, the community that your ancestors lived in, many of our ancestors lived in a community similar to Tewksbury, unless they lived downtown, you know, close to a mill. And, you know, there's so many things we can learn from those personal accounts to help us understand their lives. City directories, my other brick wall about what the heck happened from 1865 when the first family landed to when they bought their land in 1870 in Methuen. The New York City directories when I was updating my information for this talk. The digital public library, I typed in city directory, first things that popped up, New York City, from the New York Public Library, from 1786 through 1940 phone books, all digitized. So now I have a task. I need to start with 1865 and 1866 and 1867 to see if I can find the ancestors, if they stuck around long enough to be in a directory. So that's my next task for those. Also, how many people have Irish heritage? Anybody have Irish heritage? Okay, great. What about German? Anybody with German heritage? Okay, what about French Canadian? Anybody walk here? And Italians? Okay, almost all of our immigrant ancestors needed help from other people. If you had a neighbor or your niece's college roommate was relocating to Tewksbury or to the Merrimack Valley, wouldn't you be willing to help them figure out a good place to live, good places to find food, all of those things? Our ancestors did the same thing. When they came, they tried to find other people, especially if they didn't speak American English or British English. That's why we had Little Italy. That's why we had Germantown. That's why we have those cultural and ethnic clusters. They would help each other out. Well, even after they weren't necessarily living right next door to each other, my German ancestors belonged to the Turnverein, which was basically a German gymnastics and cultural center. And my great aunts told stories. They used to go to regular school, and they also had to go to German school. They also took dance lessons there. They also they had concerts, they had dances. The Oddfellows, they were a cultural group, but really they were also a social group to help out other people. The Hibernians, the Grange, the Knights of Columbus, the Chinese Cultural Center, the Japanese Cultural Center. You can go on and on and on. Whatever immigrant group your ancestors were part of, If you can't find the exact organization, that exact lodge that they belong to, you can find images of the picnic of the Turners. You can find images of the Oddfellows Hall in a neighboring town. You might be able to find pictures of the Grange meeting with the farmers all dressed up with their starched white shirts and their ties and holding their hats very stiffly in 1890 or 1900, because it was a big deal to then go to the Grange, you know, not necessarily your local Grange hall. You might be meeting to talk about planting and sharing, you know, plow horses, or, you know, helping out a family whose husband is out because he got run over by the reaper, or one of those things. But you can see what other people looked like that were part of the same cultural group as your particular family. So it's just amazing to be able to pull all of these details together and all of this information and add them to the names, dates, and places that you already have. And Robert, that's it. Do we have any questions that have come in yet?
No, the only comments and questions we've gotten have a few folks were experiencing technical difficulties on their end, but no substantive questions. So if folks have any questions for Diane, please get them into the chat and we will take a few minutes of questions. Well, and Diane, while we're waiting for questions, let me see here. What was, let me see here. So what other topics do you present on, Diane, aside from the DPLA? I think you gave me something that was a mile long. So you do a lot of presentations on a lot of different topics.
Yeah, I'm more like an intermediate generalist as opposed to, you know, Sarah really Sarah Campbell, that you'll be hearing next month, specializes more in women's history, although she has a great wealth of knowledge about her own families as well that she's researched. I have done more social history, although I don't have a current presentation put together on that. But also the most recent one I pulled together was mapping your way around brick walls and exploring the different free map resources that are out there to help you, especially try to figure out, all right, my ancestor was here and I want to go back one more generation, and where did they go? So I had a friend that had traced, I think it was her, I can't remember, it was her grandfather or great-grandfather. And it must have been her great-grandfather. She said, I found my grandfather, I have him documented. I have my great-grandfather, I have his gravesite, I have his marriage certificate, I have all of these things. I traced back and he suddenly disappears and he's nowhere in the Rhode Island records. I've gone to the graveyard, I've taken pictures, I've done everything else. Why can't I find him? And I said, I don't know, but give me what you have and I'll see what I can find. So I jumped on, and I do have an Ancestry account. And instead of just searching Rhode Island, which she was determined, he lived in Rhode Island his whole life, I just put in Rhode Island and neighboring states. And I put in his last name, and I put in, of course, Soundex, so that in case somebody massacred the name, you know, and it came up all garbled, I would see what I could come up with. Well, within 45 minutes, I found him. He was living exactly where she said. The problem was he was born in Pawtucket, but it was Pawtucket, Massachusetts, because the state line moved. Mm. So one of the big resources I used in that presentation was the Newberry Library out in Chicago, because they have a great historic county lines. You can zoom right in and you can see every single county line change and state line change for every one of the US states. So you can narrow it down, not only by year in some instances, but by month of, for example, when Boston took over something that used to be part of Middlesex County and then made it part of Suffolk County, when Suffolk County ceded some of the area, when you know, Bristol County changed shape. And you can look at it visually, but you can also look at how much acreage and changed hands and the reason for it. Was it a land swap in the case of the Rhode Island, Massachusetts border in that particular instance in the 1860s? Or was it, you know, an area breaking off or moving from one area to another?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We do have a couple of questions now in the chat. Lori says, I had a lot of success searching records while visiting the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City, Utah. Is the Mormon Church linked through DPLA?
They are not directly linked, but many of the records that are shared through the university systems out there, Brigham Young and some of the others, and the Utah records, actually the Latter-day Saints Church, all of the records that they have, or I didn't say all of them, but the vast majority of records they have are actually digitized copies from governments. So whether it's a town government, state government, and churches, and depending on when they digitize them, it could possibly be the last remaining set of those records. For example, in New Hampshire, when I was doing some research up in the Lakes region, the town clerk had the earliest records and she'd had them rebound. But when they were scanned, I think it was in the 1960s, way back when, the online scanning and what the Latter-day Saints had scanned at that particular time stopped in, I want to say, 1820 or so. And I was looking for records for 1830. So I called the town clerk, and the town clerk did have the records. She didn't realize that they'd ever been scanned, of course, because it was before her time as an adult as it was mine. So the Latter-day Saints have many, many records, including some of the churches that existed when they got scanned, but may have dissolved by now and records could have been lost. So it's always good. And there is a great family history center in, I want to say, Linfield, I think, that people can go down and they're open. You do have to make an appointment now with COVID, but there are records there that you can access from there that you can't access through Family Search, which is affiliated with the Latter-day Saints as Ancestry is. Family Search is their nonprofit, basically, and Ancestry is their for-profit. But everything is basically scanned first and put up through Family Search. And then eventually when it's indexed, gets moved over and is shared with Ancestry.
All right, so I'm gonna ask Diane one last question, and then we'll transition over to audience sharing. And at that point, I will stop recording. And I will allow people to unmute and speak during audience sharing. Certainly if you're not comfortable sharing anything, or if you have nothing to share, then that's fine. But we would just be looking at, recent successes or failures or roadblocks or breakthroughs or any progress you're making. And I do believe that Diane will probably stay on the line to eavesdrop and maybe offer a tip or two. So last question goes to Linda. Linda wants to know, and this is great, would you please take a few minutes again to discuss the Merrimack Valley Society that you belong to? So why don't you put one last plug in for your organization?
Sure. The Merrimack Valley chapter is one of 4 chapters of the Massachusetts Society of Genealogists, otherwise known as MSOG Inc. So the website is MS as in Sam, OGINC.org, O-R-G. So that's the main website. We are going to be transitioning to a new platform in June. But that's our main website. You can take a look. And currently all of our chapters are virtual. So we're doing everything online. Bristol chapter mostly is using Zoom, although the other 3 chapters are using GoToWebinar. We also have a Facebook group. So it's $25 for a membership year. And with the virtual meetings and with the in-person meetings, they're all free and open to the public. So if you are interested, look for us on Facebook, Massachusetts Society of Genealogists, MSOG Inc. It's very easy to just find us and take a look at our calendar of events. In order to attend on GoToWebinar, you just have to put in and register, and then you get a free email link, just pretty much similar to Zoom, except that it's a little bit different in some of the tweaks. And we're fortunate when COVID hit, out of the 4 chapters, we missed a total of 1 meeting. Everybody else, all of us, because we were used to using it for our monthly webinar for members only, we were able to immediately, when the library shut down, switched right over, and we did not miss, other than 1 chapter meeting, because everything was shut down like the day before their meeting. Everybody else was able to transition online, and we have presenters that speak virtually from all over the place. Last week, we had somebody from the South Essex Registry of Deeds here in Massachusetts. The previous meeting was the DNA SIG meeting. Our speaker was in London. So he gave up his Saturday evening to speak to us, our time on a Saturday afternoon. And our Bristol chapter is headquartered down in Somerset, but there's 4 different chapters at the moment.
All right, well, let's give Diane a big virtual round of applause for joining us tonight and giving us a wonderful presentation and answering all our questions. Just a reminder, I hope to see many of you next month. I will provide information on next month in the email I send out tomorrow morning, along with the feedback survey. But again, next month is Tuesday, May 25th, 7 o'clock, Researching Women's Lives with Sarah E. Campbell. All right, so at this point, I am going to stop recording.